All right, and we are live.
We
Hello,
are.
everybody. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We are in week number 3
Yes.
as we are walking towards Easter and through the Lent season. And so we are having these conversations every single Wednesday here live at 11 a.m. And this will be on demand after this, but we are having a conversation about the life and teachings of Jesus as we walk towards Easter. So to everybody who's watching, and I have the Facebook app pulled up, so if you're watching through the Vintage app or maybe through our Apple TV app or wherever you're watching, welcome. Thank you for being here. But for all of you who are with us on Facebook, hey, thanks for hanging out with us. Jasmine, we haven't really even hardly talked this morning.
I know.
Other than, I feel like I'm at a news anchor desk.
We did a little bit about being news anchors and talking about drive-by fruitings.
I feel like I'm supposed to give highlights for a basketball game.
We could definitely do that.
But I don't really watch basketball anymore.
I have to say,
you're a college basketball fan,
I love college basketball, but college basketball without fans, it doesn't feel as fun.
College sports in general, they're just a different vibe, right?
For
they're
sure.
a different vibe.
Very different vibe. And because they're this is really not about Lent.
Well, we're giving everybody a chance to kind of hop on, settle in.
Okay. Yeah. So to me, because college sports are so tied into that university and to that student body, when there are players absent from the greater body, it just doesn't feel...
It's a different vibe, man.
It is. It's so different. I mean, it is the sport in its purest.
Right.
But I would maybe argue that it's not. Because part of the grit of college sports is everybody being there and dressed in their stuff.
It's kind of like worship gatherings without people in the room.
You're absolutely right.
It's just not the same.
It's just not the same.
It's just not the same.
We going through the same motions and still with, pure talent, pure heart, all of that.
Right.
But it's just not the same.
Yeah. But that makes me think I'm excited that this last year on Easter, we had to film something in the building without people in it. This year, that will not be the case. We will have people in the building. And go ahead and just kind of announce this. We're going to be having an additional worship gathering.
3 gatherings that day.
There are going to be 3 gatherings on Sunday, April the 4th.
Correct. That is Easter.
It's Easter Sunday. There will be 3 gatherings, 3 different opportunities for you to worship with us. We're going to have an opportunity to get more people in the building. And it will also, all 3 are going to be streamed online as well. But as we walk towards Easter, we decided that every Wednesday we were going to have a conversation walking through the life and teachings of Jesus. Because our Sunday morning series isn't necessarily an Easter series, but it's a topic that God really put on our hearts to lean into that we start this Sunday called Salt and Light. Mm-hmm. And actually where Jesus makes that reference of calling us the salt of the earth and the light of the world is in the context of the greater thing that we want to dive in today.
Yep.
Because we started last week kind of walking through the life and teachings of Jesus, beginning with what we called from birth to baptism. Just recognizing that there is a huge portion of Jesus' life that we know next to nothing about.
Right.
And unpacking kind of what that means. But even though we know so little, we can learn so much. Mm-hmm. That we don't have to have a huge portion of the story to learn really important truths. And we kind of summarized that Jesus was learning in that season patience and humility and surrender. Yeah. And man, that's just some powerful stuff. But then Jesus comes on the scene. Mm-hmm. He's baptized by John the Baptist. He starts his earthly ministry. He begins to walk up to these random, seems like to us, divinely appointed by God, but the most unlikely group of people where he would say, hey, I want you to come follow me.
Yeah.
And even before we get into the Sermon on the Mount, maybe let's talk about that for a second.
Let's talk about that for a second, because before we talk about Sermon on the Mount, it's really important that we set up what has happened before he has this time of teaching. And also, we see largely the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew. It touches on some of the same things in the Sermon on the Mount in the other Gospels, but in its entirety, it's in the book of Matthew as one long teaching.
Yeah.
And so first, let's talk about Matthew. So Matthew, this is the first of the Gospels. It's probably the first Gospel that was written, and it was heavily used in the early church. So he was writing to a primarily Jewish audience.
Because that was his background.
That was his background. And he was communicating all of these things to other Jews. And so a lot of the things that stood out to Matthew as a person was tied to his Jewish faith, and so much of what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, kind of echoed what the children of Israel would have seen from Moses on the mountain when he communicated the law.
Yeah.
And so I think this really struck a chord with Matthew, and he wrote down all of these teachings of Jesus. So before, like, kind of leading up to the Sermon on the Mount, he had not called all of the apostles.
No, or that we know of.
That we know of.
Yeah.
So when it talks about that, he went up, so Matthew 5, verse 1, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And so when we see this word disciples, most of the time when we think about disciples, we think about those 12, but it wasn't necessarily pointing to the 12. It was just talking about people who were following him, who he was teaching.
Right, because at the time when Matthew is giving us the Sermon on the Mount, we don't really know how many people, who all the disciples represented, because there's another place in the Gospels when Jesus specifically chooses the 12 to be the group of people that he would intentionally invest in, which is one reason why we do a life group model of 12 people,
Sure.
because I think you're right. There's a time we think, well, Jesus only had 12 disciples, but there were many people that considered themselves to be disciples of Jesus throughout Jesus' life and ministry. Mm-hmm. But there's a time, and maybe some people didn't know this, where he goes up on a mountain for an evening and prays and talks to the Father.
Yes.
And then he comes down and he says, you, and he handpicks 12 among that larger group of people to say, I'm going to more intensely and intentionally invest in you, because the role that you're going to have when I'm gone is going to be greater than the others. And so I want to prepare you for that. Matthew was one of those.
Yes.
And so just when the Sermon on the Mount happens, it's not Jesus and like 10 or 12 people.
Yeah.
It could have been hundreds at this point, because we also know there's a moment too later in the Gospels that we'll dive into where Jesus says some really hard things and many leave.
Yes.
And about the time that we get to Easter and the resurrection and all that kind of stuff, we think 100, 150 maybe that have kind of stuck through it to that point. So we don't know how big a crowd is sitting around Jesus when he goes up to this mountain and starts to just teach on, it feels like he's shotgun preaching. And what I mean by that is like splatter, because in this sermon, it starts with the Beatitudes and then it covers all these different subjects.
Yes.
And you said, you mentioned the like Sermon on the Mount in its entirety. There's no question that Matthew records most or more of the sermon than others.
In one shot.
But even as I was rereading this and thinking about it as we were preparing for our conversation today, I wonder, is this it?
It can't be.
Because we know.
This is what he remembers.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe these are the things that were really stuck out to him because of his experience, because of his life.
Yeah.
But we don't know if Jesus taught for an hour, 2 hours, or days.
Well, and a lot, let's see, I'm trying to find the phrase. He opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying. So this phrase is not by mistake. That whole, he opened his mouth and began to teach them, because a lot of times teachers would teach just by action. And they would just demonstrate. And so it's not superfluous for him to say he opened his mouth and began to teach them. So he taught not only by action, but also by word.
Yeah.
Because, Jesus is the living word.
Yeah.
And when it said, and began to teach them, that phrase actually means like, these are the things that he taught them. Not just that one time. And you say it to us a lot as a staff. You say, I don't say a lot of things, but I say a few things a lot of times.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the vibe. That this wasn't the only time that Jesus taught about these things. And everywhere he went, when he encountered new people, he would teach these things. These were the things that he wanted to teach us by word.
Yeah. And you see this, again, I don't want to use the word, I keep wanting to use the word random because it's a plethora.
Sure, yes.
which is a fun word.
It is a fun word.
It's a
Rolls
plethora
off the tongue.
of subjects from, again, if you have a Bible like mine with the red letters and the little headings and that kind of stuff, which y'all know, chapters and verses and headings were not in. When Matthew wrote all this stuff down, he didn't put chapter 5, verse 1.
Right.
This was all later put in by different people, and sometimes it doesn't fit as well.
Sure.
Where we've broken things up in Scripture. But the earliest people that were trying to figure out what it meant to follow Jesus, who would have had original manuscripts of Matthew's reflections and recollections of his time with Jesus, would have just had these parchment with this just flowing.
Yeah.
No verses, no chapter numbers, no headings, no anything. So when Jesus goes to talk about murder after he's talking about salt and light and the fulfillment of the law, it would have just flown right into that.
Yes.
And when I read that, I think, when I read it in my Bible, I finish, then I see, okay, murder. Jesus is about to talk about murder next, and I can somewhat mentally prepare for it.
Right, but if you took all of those headings out and you were just listening to Jesus say all of these things, it's like
drinking
whiplash.
from a fire hose.
Yes.
Yeah. And what you see is, again, the Sermon on the Mount, if you're looking in the Gospel of Matthew, it starts in chapter 5 and it moves basically almost into through chapter 7.
Yep.
And it starts with the Beatitudes and moves forward. But you see, Jesus really hits on all kinds of subjects, things that would have been somewhat controversial.
Yes.
And his take on things would be a bit controversial. Things that would have been very culturally relevant. You see him hit the whole gamut.
Yeah, you really do. And there's something in here for everyone at every point in their life.
Yeah.
And you said something yesterday, we were kind of going over what we wanted to cover today, talking about comfort and conviction.
Yeah, as I read it this time, I thought it's the sermon reflects who Jesus was in total.
Yes.
This combination of conviction and compassion or comfort. That one minute he says something that just, like when he's saying, you've heard that not to commit adultery. I say if you look at somebody who's not your spouse, you've committed adultery in your own heart, and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
And then at the same time he says, when you pray, go into your closet and shut the door, and your Father sees what's done in secret, and this is how you can pray, Abba, Father. And it's like, and it's like, and it's like, so it's just this balance of grace with truth, conviction and with comfort. And truth should always elicit both.
Yes.
It should create conviction, but it should also bring comfort.
Yes. Well, and I think at different times, these verses have brought both conviction and comfort at different points. So, for example, Matthew 5:43, it says, starting verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And, go throughout that passage, but that's a really comforting passage to me. And I think, there may be times that it was a conviction of, I only think bad things about my enemy, and I only want good things for good people, and I want bad things for bad people. But when I think of he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, the righteous sends rain to the righteous. And how many times in my life have I been unrighteous?
Yeah.
And I'm so thankful that I was not abandoned in those moments. And instead, God sees beyond a label of good and bad.
Yeah.
And he sends it to both. And so how much more should I extend that to others? And how blessed I am when they extend it to me when I don't deserve it.
Yeah, because you've been both.
I have been both.
Yeah, we've all been both. And I think that, as I've reread this again, and if you haven't done this as part of your kind of Lent preparation, and that's what we've kind of invited everyone to do, is to not kind of rush through this Easter season believing that how much more powerful will the celebration on Resurrection Sunday be if we've all really taken this Lenten season to lean into the life of Jesus and reflect on it and prepare ourselves for it. It's just going to make for a better celebration. And part of that is the life and teachings of Jesus and leaning into this sermon. Mm-hmm. And when you lean into it, you see those things. And I just can't move away from that. This is who Jesus was. He spoke the truth, and it created conviction. But in truth, there's conviction, but there's also comfort. Yeah. And so many people you can't embrace one without the other. Mm-hmm. That you can't experience comfort without that conviction, and you can't experience conviction without comfort. Like they are interwoven. They are connected to one another in such a way. And you know, as I read this, there's so many verses that just hit home and remind me of difficult things that I need to wrestle with, and even remind me of things as a pastor leading in our culture. Mm-hmm. You know, when Jesus starts talking about like things like divorce and oaths and eye for an eye and all these different things, it's like, man, Jesus spoke these words to a group of people that we couldn't think would be more different than us, but how relevant these topics are. Sure. I personally think that the Sermon on the Mount was much broader than this, and he talked about more things than Matthew recorded. Sure. Because I thought about this morning, we don't have the entire story.
No.
We don't have, when we're talking about studying the life and teachings of Jesus, we don't have that full scope. No. Not just in his early years where he was hidden, but there's not enough to cover 3 years. John would even say in his gospel, if we wrote down
everything, there's not enough books in the world. The world cannot contain the amount of books that would be written to record everything that Jesus has done. For me, I think that what Matthew gets at is really the heart of what Jesus wanted to teach. Because in the Sermon on the Mount, he says that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And so a lot of what he covers here is the law. Because what had happened was after the law came into existence, was spoken, through the Lord to Moses in the desert as they were going from Egypt to the Promised Land. What had happened over centuries was that the religious leaders basically took the law and turned it into a bunch of check boxes. Right. And they literally made it their job to keep perfectly every piece of the law.
And to police it in the lives of others.
Yes, and to police it. And so what they did was they lorded the law over people. But what happened in their checkboxing was they missed the whole point of the law, the whole purpose of the law. The law was made not to give you a list of thou shalls and thou shall nots, but to help us to point to who we are to be. Yeah. And
the way I put it is the law was intended to show the gap between our brokenness and God's holiness.
Yes. And Paul teaches that basically the law made us aware of our sin and how greatly we needed Jesus. Yeah. Because nobody can keep all of the law. Yeah. And that was one of the first interactions that I had with the Sermon on the Mount. And guys, I'm bringing the bingo. I got 2 big Bibles today.
We made a comment of, is how spiritual you are judged by the size of your Bible. I have this one little thin line Bible. Jasmine's got 2 Crush a Baby Bibles.
That's right. I got Crush a Baby Bible. So this is the first Bible that I ever had. This is a Precious Moments Bible.
That's fantastic.
I know. It was gifted to me by my grandparents, Nana and Poppy, on December 25th, 1987. I was 4 years old.
4 years old.
I was 4. Mm-hmm. And
That's cool.
Yeah. So, but Bibles were a super big deal because remember at this time, there were no screens in church. They didn't, when the preacher preached, the scripture was not on the screens.
No.
You had to have it in a Bible.
Yeah.
And so taking your Bible to church was a really big deal. Now, I was 4 years old. I couldn't read yet, but it was a really big deal to me that I took my Bible to church every week because that's what you're supposed to do. So after I was saved, after I was baptized, I was in late elementary school, so probably 5th grade, maybe 6th grade, when I really started actually reading my Bible, my New King James, Precious Moments Bible.
The New King James.
New King James, yeah. So almost holy. And I started reading it for more than just looking at the cute pictures. Guys, were you Precious Moments people? If you were Precious Moments people, pop
We actually had a
right
Precious Moments bride and groom cake topper at our wedding.
Did you really?
Legit. We still have it somewhere.
I know you probably can't see that. So this whole Bible was littered with these really cute pictures.
Big-headed children.
Big-headed, big-eyed children.
That was the Precious Moments way.
Yeah. So I started actually reading it for its words. And I wish I could remember why I started, where I started. But I started in Matthew, I guess. And I started reading the Sermon on the Mount. The very first thing that I ever highlighted in my Bible, it's right here. You can see my highlight right here. First thing I ever highlighted in a Bible was in the Sermon on the Mount. It says this. I know. It says, Matthew 5:27. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. I was in 5th or 6th grade, guys, okay? I was not thinking about committing adultery because I barely understood what it was. You shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And that's the first thing that I ever highlighted. And what an odd thing, but I remember the conviction in that moment.
Yeah.
Not because I had lusted after somebody in my heart, but because I understood for the first time that God didn't want us to keep a checklist. He wanted to change our hearts.
Yeah.
Now, I probably couldn't have articulated it that clearly as a 5th grader, but I understood that there was something about us that needed to change, and that needed to change so much that God sent his son to do it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. It's reminding us that religion is more than about keeping a list of rules, but it's about becoming more like Jesus.
Yeah, because the nation of Israel had this habit of the law was the bar set by God, and you can reach the bar.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, let me just unpack this for you, that as high as the bar was by what you saw in the law, the bar that God has is even higher.
Right.
And I'm not here to lower the bar, but I'm here to do what's necessary to raise you up. And that's the whole point of the thing is Jesus didn't come and say, okay, all these bars that you feel like God has set, or you've turned these into bars that God set, and for generations now, y'all have been trying to jump up and reach these bars. Actually, the bar is so much higher.
Right.
And you in and of yourselves are incapable of reaching it. And what I've come to do is to usher in the new covenant, to start making the shift, to help you better understand, to fulfill the law that was given. Well,
and he even says in Matthew 5, verse 20, he says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven.
And think about who he's talking about there. These are the people they idolized as holy.
Yeah. Well, they were the ones that made such a big deal about their religion. And so much of what he talked about in the Sermon on the Mount was a direct gut punch to the Pharisees, to the keepers of the law, because they were the one. This is where, he goes into, when you pray, don't pray standing up with your hands raised and making a big deal, but go into your closet. Keep it between you and the Lord. When you fast, when you give to the poor, don't make a big show of it, because that's what the Pharisees did.
Yeah.
They made a big show to say, this is how you do it, guys. And Jesus is saying, no. that's actually not how you do it. You think that that's the bar. You think like that these are the people who are doing it. But unless what you do surpasses that, and when you hear that, you think, oh gosh,
Yeah.
I don't have time to do that.
Yeah. It's a game changer in so many
Yeah.
ways. Well, to me, as I was reading through this and as we talked yesterday, the part of the Sermon on the Mount that I've probably read more than any other is one of those, I guess, more comforting than convicting. But I would say even in this passage where it talks about worry,
Yeah.
it is both comforting and convicting.
Yes.
Because the release of worry that Jesus talks about is predicated on what he says toward the end. You know, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, like this, of all the Sermon on the Mount, I've probably read this section of it more than other because by nature, I worry about everything. Y'all have heard me say that. If I'm not worried about something, I freak out and start to worry that I don't have something to worry about. Like that's just how I am. And, you know, Jesus says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is life not more than clothes? And he just keeps talking about worry. And like God takes care of the birds and he takes care of the fields and all this other kind of stuff. But then, verse 33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. That what's going to equip you to override and overcome the worry is when I'm first and I am the priority of your life and I am the primary pursuit of what you're doing. It puts you in a position where you don't have to worry.
Right. Because it shifts your perspective.
And then it's that conviction is, okay, it's comforting not to worry. Then the conviction of, oh man, where are my priorities? And where am I seeking him first? And even though that's probably my go-to in the Sermon on the Mount, and after we continued to talk as preparing for this conversation, I found, because I always thought that, that's the comforting part. But again, it's not. It is both comforting and convicting.
Yeah.
And both lead into and connect to each other. It's just amazing, man.
It really is. And I think that this also teaches us that there is no area of our life that is free and clear from being touched by Jesus. That, you know, a lot of times we have these sort of taboo things like that. Oh, we don't talk about that. Like we don't talk about money, or we don't talk about adultery, or we don't talk about, you know, hating our neighbor, or we don't talk about what happens, you know, when you're in a fight or in an argument with a brother, and then you go to worship. Like we don't talk about some of those things because we think, oh, that's too personal. Like that's between you and the Lord. And Jesus is like, no, we're going to talk about all of these things.
Yeah.
Because I want all of your life.
Right.
And so if it's part of your life, it's worth talking about.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways, this gives us permission to speak these things, obviously in love, but with one another.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're right. He does talk about everything from where you invest your money to worry, to prayer, to the foundations of your life, all of these things. And I was just looking at verses 28 and 29. It says, when Jesus, of chapter 7, it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Yeah.
That they had heard people skirt the fringes of these topics for decades. And then all of a sudden, Jesus comes out and he unpacks these things in a way that's like, yeah, we're familiar with these topics. It's not that we've never heard teaching on these topics, but the authority with which and the clarity with which Jesus and the conviction and the comfort with which he brings this kind of changed everything.
Yeah. Well, and he teaching as authority would have been very different from what they were used to, because most teachers at that time did not speak words of their own. When they would teach, they would reference the teaching of another teacher. And Jesus came and he says, I am the teacher.
Yeah.
So he had that authority. And so everything that he said would have not only the topics that he covered, but the manner in which he spoke would have garnered a lot of attention because it was so different than anything that they had heard.
Yeah. and just the personal language
Yes.
that Jesus is, and he's not, even the location. We're not in the synagogue where I'm up in this position of being lofty or higher. Like I'm speaking authority because of who I am, not just because what's been assigned to me or given to me by man. And it's powerful. It's, if you have not ever leaned into the Sermon on the Mount, or maybe it's been a while, I think especially what you're going to find is in 2021, you're going to hear Jesus dive into topics that are as relevant now as they've always been.
Yep.
And it will bring conviction and comfort to your heart. So make that a part of your time as you're continuing to walk through this Lenten season, as we're preparing ourselves to celebrate Easter, and we're spending this 40-day Lent period doing whatever we're doing, whether you're fasting or adding some extra scripture reading into your routine, doing something a little bit different, just disrupting that rhythm to more intentionally lean into God. Dive into Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7 and let Jesus be your preacher for a few days.
Yeah. And we would really like to know, what are you learning? What's God teaching you?
Yeah.
What comfort and what conviction do you find in the Sermon on the Mount? Have that conversation with us. Have that conversation with the people that you come in contact with this week. Because there's so much there to unpack.
Yeah. Share with us. Maybe if you're watching online, if you're with us on Facebook, maybe even put in the comments. We'll go back and check them out. If there's other things that maybe help us give us some direction. We're going to keep systematically walking through the life and teachings of Jesus all the way up through Easter. And so we kind of have a little bit of an outline or schedule. But if there's things about his life or his teaching that you would like to see Jasmine and I kind of unpack as a part of this conversation, we'd love to hear from you. And just maybe for our own encouragement, we'd love to hear, man, are you enjoying these? Are you finding these helpful? If you're watching it on Facebook, share it so other folks can dive into it and maybe make it a part of their Lenten routine as well.
Yep.
So,
also, my mom's watching. Hi, Mom.
So is my mom. So hi, Mom. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you next time.
Bye.